our speaker for today. Jen Samp is here to give us a presentation and seminar. Jen is a College of Pharmacy grad, a PhD candidate in our program. Will be defending her dissertation in 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, something, soon. She'll be defending it soon. She's currently a full-time employee at AbbVie, so she's balancing finishing her work here with doing her actual job there. She's going to talk to us today about one of her aims of her dissertation, the comparative effectiveness aim between treatments for patients with COPD. All right, thanks, Jen.
So thanks, Todd. Is everyone on the line able to hear me? Make this bigger. I assume that that's a yes. So you could chat us if you can't hear me, and then we'll be able to see that chat. So I am presenting on the first aim for my dissertation. It's looking at the comparative effectiveness of different bronchodilator-based combinations for the treatment of COPD. This aim is specifically focused on efficacy. My second aim is looking at safety, and my third aim is looking at the ability to predict exacerbations among this patient population and what factors are attributed to that. This paper was done with the help of my committee that the members are listed here. And then I will also say that it has been accepted for publication in pharmacotherapy and will be coming out in April. So today I'll give a background on COPD. I'll dive into what the specific aim of this study is and what my hypothesis was going into this. I will go over my research design and methods. I'll review the results and discuss some of the limitations of this research. So as many of you guys know, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or otherwise known as COPD, is a disease of really irreversible airflow limitation. So there are a lot of therapies that are available to help with the symptoms of COPD, but there is no therapy that is going to cure patients. So because the baby boomer population is aging, the incidence of COPD has been increasing over time, and it's now actually become the third leading cause of death in the United States. So exacerbations are a major costly part of COPD disease. In 2010, it was estimated that COPD in general led to direct healthcare cost of over $30 billion. And this has been projected to increase all the way to $53 billion by 2020. So we're almost at 2020, but we haven't seen a revision of those numbers, but we know that they've likely gone up significantly since that last estimate came out. So I've already gone over the fact that no medications can really prevent the progressive decline of lung function, but the goal of them are to provide symptom relief for the patients, prevent exacerbations, and improve quality of life. Bronchodilators are really the mainstay of therapy and treatment in COPD disease, and these drugs work by relaxing airway smooth muscle so that patients can breathe better and they have better lung function. So there's two different types of bronchodilators. The first are called beta-2 agonists. So these drugs work specifically by stimulating the beta-2 adrenergic receptors. This releases cyclic AMP throughout the body and then causes a bronchodilation. Then the other type of bronchodilators are called anticholinergic or muscarinic antagonists. And these bronchodilators have a slightly different mechanism of action, which is to block acetylcholine's effect on the muscarinic receptors, which then leads to bronchodilation. So among both of these two different types of bronchodilators, there's both short-acting agents and then there's long-acting agents. So SABAs are the short-acting beta-2 agonists, LABAs are the long-acting beta-2 agonists, and same with SAMAs and LAMAs. So when patients progress, you generally add on another therapy to the bronchodilator. And this is generally an inhaled corticosteroid or physicians will combine the two different bronchodilators because they're thought to have synergistic effects. So I'll say that the LABA-ICS combination has been available in a fixed dose for a very long time, and I'll talk about the LABA-LAMA combinations in just a bit. But I wanted to give a picture of what the guidelines look like now for the treatment of COPD. So these are the 2017 guidelines, and they've actually changed quite a bit from the 2016 version, which was very consistent with the 2015 version and the 2014 version. So I think it's worthwhile touching on this, and I'll point out what this looks like and what those changes were. So you can see that patients are grouped into 4 different disease categories, Group A through Group D. And then they are grouped into each of these boxes based on their exacerbation history or symptom scores as measured by the MMRC or the CAT. So patients in Group A are obviously the least severe patients, and these patients are generally treated with some type of bronchodilator, whether that's short-acting bronchodilator or a long-acting bronchodilator. Then when you move to Group B, patients are treated with then definitely a long-acting bronchodilator, whether that's a LABA or LAMA, and then if symptoms progress in this patient group, then they recommend combination of LABA and LAMA. This is actually very different than the guidelines were in 2016. Prior to this, LABA-ICS was the preferred regimen, and LABA-LAMA was the secondary regimen. So you also see that this recommendation for LABA-LAMA is in Group C, where patients can progress from a LAMA to a LAMA plus LABA, or another option, which is kind of a secondary option, is a LABA plus ICS. I'll say that this addition of this LAMA here as the preferred therapy over LABA is also a change from the 2016 guidelines, which said that they recommended a bronchodilator, but there was not too much evidence of one over the other. There was a statement in there saying that LAMAs have better efficacy, but have been shown to have better lung function, but that you should really make a decision based on one of these two. It's more like patient preference and whatever the patient responds to better. So then going to Group D, we can see similar things as in the other two groups. The LAMA is recommended first, and then the LABA-LAMA combination, and then the preferred, if patients are still having symptoms, is to go with a triple combination. So I set that stage here because a primary focus of my research is looking at this LABA-LAMA combination. And when I started my dissertation a few years back, there was only one LABA-LAMA fixed dose combination that had been approved at the time. And this was actually approved as recently as December of 2013. So since I've been doing this research, 2 other combinations have been approved. And there's actually a 4th combination that is by AstraZeneca that's been developed, but it's only been approved in the EU at this point. So overall, the LABA-LAMAs have been shown to improve lung function and have a pretty good safety profile, but most of the studies have been compared to placebo or compared to treatment with the monotherapy agents. So there's really limited comparative efficacy to LABA plus ICS. What I will say here is when I started my research, all 3 of these drug combinations have a very robust clinical development program behind them, which may be what has led to their preferred status in the COPD guidelines. But this combination by Novartis, this very first one listed here, was the only one to compare to LABA-ICS or have published evidence compared to LABA-ICS. They actually had another publication that came out in, I want to say, November of 2016, where they showed additional evidence compared to LABA-ICS, and they showed reduced exacerbations in that group. Then, I forget forget which one. I think it's a third one here, has had clinical trials compared to LABA ICS, but to my knowledge, none of those clinical trials have been published up until this point. So as many of us already know, in drug development, the clinical trials establish the efficacy of the drug and they establish the safety of the drug, but then it's really post-approval that we can see this real-world effectiveness and what that safety profile looks like in a much broader population of COPD patients. So the question I wanted to fill was, what does this real-world effectiveness look like for the LABA plus LAMA combination, and what does that safety look like in the real world? So these are the two data gaps that my study will be filling. And I will say up until this point, there has not been any real-world studies looking at LABA-LAMA. Although the fixed-dose agents have only recently become approved, they have been recommended in the guidelines for quite some time now, so people have been able to use these agents individually together. So there is opportunity to look at this in the real world. So my first aim of my study was to compare rates of COPD exacerbations between patients treated with combination LABA plus LAMA versus those treated with combination LABA plus ICS. And I hypothesized that the LABA-LAMA cohort would have lower rates of COPD exacerbations because they have this synergistic effect where they work on both two different mechanisms of action that would ultimately lead to better bronchodilation, more symptom improvement, and less COPD exacerbations. So I designed the study as a retrospective observational study, and I looked at Truven Health Market Scan commercial and Medicare databases, and I looked at this data from 2004 to 2014. I identified patients with COPD by ICD-9 claims, and then I used the prescription claims databases to assign patients into cohorts. So I looked at the first point at which they were had evidence of taking both of these medications. So combination medication use I defined as separate prescriptions filled within a window of 15 days or a prescription fill for a combination product. And since I looked at data through 2014, I was able to capture about 100 or so patients that were treated with the new fixed dose LABA-LAMAs. Patients had to be 40 years of age or older. They had to have 6 months of continuous enrollment before that index date defined as the first date of combination medication use that I've defined above. They had to have a fill, there had to be no fills for a medication from the opposite cohort within 30 days prior to that index date. So for example, if a patient who met the criteria for a LAMA also had an ICS during that time period, I assume that they were being treated with all 3 of those medications at once, and I removed them from my analytic cohort. If patients had a diagnosis code for asthma during that 6 months pre-index baseline period, they were also removed. And then I wanted only patients that I defined as continuous users of these medications. So they had to at least have 2 fills for the combination study medications. And I said that these had to be 2 consecutive fills. So index date, first date of combination use of the medications. Then we had the baseline period of 6 months. The study period I had starting 30 days post the index date. And then it would continue for the duration of time that the patient continued to be exposed to the combination medications. The reason that I had the study period start 30 days after the index date is because I didn't want any exacerbations that had occurred during the baseline period to be misclassified as study-related events. And generally, sometimes those exacerbation claims will carry over for about 30 days after that event. So my outcomes were COPD exacerbation rates, and I categorized these outcomes as either outpatient exacerbations, ED exacerbations, or inpatient exacerbations. Outpatient and ED exacerbations were visits with a diagnosis code for COPD, plus a prescription for an oral corticosteroid or oral antibiotic within 5 days of the visit. And I required less than 30 days for the corticosteroid or antibiotic in order to ensure that this wasn't for chronic use. Inpatient exacerbations were inpatient hospitalizations with a primary discharge diagnosis for COPD. And then we looked at all of these, each of these types of exacerbations together as one group. So totaled the number of exacerbations from all of these exacerbation types into one group. This is a study timeline just to be able to visualize that. We have this post-index period that varies for each of these patients, starting with that 30-day lag from the index date. So I collected a bunch of different covariates in the baseline period. I looked at baseline demographics that were available within the claims data and a number of enrollment pieces of information. I looked at 47 distinct comorbidity categories that were determined by a literature review to be associated with COPD, COPD treatment, or COPD outcomes. And I used the AHRQ to link ICD-9 codes to these different comorbidity categories. Then I developed several proxies for COPD disease severity. Baseline rescue inhaler use, so the number of months of coverage they had with a baseline with a rescue inhaler. Acute prescriptions for corticosteroids and antibiotics, acute meaning less than 30 days supply. Classes of COPD medications, so there's 7 different classes of COPD medications, and I looked at the total number of classes of COPD medications that the patients were treated with. Number of physician visits with a diagnosis code for COPD, number of ED visits with a diagnosis code for COPD, and then number of inpatient hospitalizations with a primary diagnosis code for COPD. So I reported means, medians, and ranges for the continuous variables and frequencies and percentages for the categorical variables, and performed t-test and chi-square test to compare the values between the cohorts. Then to analyze outcomes, I looked at exacerbation rates, so number of exacerbations over the follow-up time in which patients continued to be exposed to the combination study medications. And I compared these between the LABA-LAMA and the LABA-ICS cohort using a generalized linear model with a log-link and Poisson distribution. So I did a stepwise model building approach to examine potential covariates for inclusion in the final GLM model. And I analyzed these variables in bivariate and multivariate analyses to determine what covariates were influential. And then I did a my base model is using the stepwise model building approach, or I guess not a stepwise model building approach, but using this approach where I'm looking at the covariates, including them that look like they have an effect on the outcome. But then for a sensitivity analysis, I looked at the model, including all of the covariates that I had, to see if that significantly changed the results at all. And then any p-value less than 0.05 was considered statistically significant. So this is my sample selection table. I won't go through this all in detail, but this outlines all of the inclusion criteria and each of the exclusion criteria. So patients 40 years of age or older have a claim for COPD, no claim for asthma. They had to have the baseline period. They could not have a medication from the opposite cohort within 30 days. I excluded any patients that had only a first fill of those study medications because I wanted only continuous users. And then I excluded patients who lost eligibility within that 30 days of the index date. So I ended up with a sample size for my LABA ICS cohort of 473,000 patients, roughly, and for my LABA-LAMA cohort, that made up about 5,000 patients. Sorry, something I realized that I did not mention on this slide is when patients were censored. So patients were followed up until 3 different events happened. So they would have discontinued one of the combination study medications, and discontinuation was defined as a gap of 2 times the day supply of the prior medication, or they had to have started one of the medications from the opposite cohort. So for example, patients who are in the LABA-LAMA group, if they initiated ICS at any time point within the study period, they were censored, or at which point they lost enrollment eligibility. So this is a table showing a comparison of the baseline demographics of each of my cohorts. So in general, okay, I did not highlight anything here. But in general, we see that there are more males in this LABA-LAMA cohort. They are generally an older patient population compared to the LABA-ICS cohort that has a mean age of 60. There's not too much difference with regards to region, although it was statistically significant. There are significantly more patients in the LABA-LAMA cohort who had Medicare coverage. This makes sense, I think, with the older age. And then there's pretty varying rates in terms of the year of index, but there's really no huge pattern here in terms of when patients were initiated on one of these drugs. Obviously, I think we see a lot more patients in 2004 who are on LABA-ICS, but I think that's just due to us requiring that the first claim for the combination study medications was when patients entered the study or were eligible for the study. This is a comparison of the comorbidities between the 2 groups, and in general we see that the LABA-LAMA cohort is a much more severe cohort in terms of they have higher frequencies of many of these comorbidities. So congestive heart failure was one in which they have almost twice the frequency. Lower respiratory disease, they had about 20% higher frequency here. Cancer was higher, as well as lung cancer. Heart disease was another comorbidity, and then atherosclerosis, which I point out. But I think if you look across all of these, you see that consistently the LABA-LAMA cohort has higher frequencies of these comorbidities. Then I compared the proxies for COPD disease severity, and again, in general, we're seeing that the LABA-LAMA cohort seems to have proxies indicating more severe COPD. So when I looked at spirometry claims in the baseline, the LABA-LAMA cohort had about almost twice the number of spirometry claims. When I looked that was also the same for rescue inhaler month supply, which is right below spirometry claims. They have a slightly higher rate of monthly, slightly higher mean monthly supply. In terms of the number of classes of COPD prescriptions, again, LABA-LAMA seems higher. And then in terms of number of physician visits for COPD, they have a much higher mean number compared to the LABA-ICS cohort. And this table is comparing exacerbations between the two cohorts. So you'll look at follow-up. Before I go into that, if you look at follow-up time, we have pretty long follow-up time for each of these cohorts, but it is pretty different between the two groups. So a mean of about 168 days in the LABA-ICS cohort, and then about 278 days in the LABA-LAMA cohort. And this range is pretty great as well. So the exacerbations, I put in annualized rates of exacerbations. So remember, this is based on the number of the amount of follow-up time for each patient. So you see these ranges are very broad, very wide, because we have some patients that had only 1 day of follow-up, but then they had an exacerbation on that day. But then in general, you see that these exacerbation rates are higher in the LABA-LAMA cohort compared to the LABA-ICS cohort. So then I built my models to adjust for these very different covariates between the two groups. And so the unadjusted rate ratio for the LABA-LAMA cohort versus the LABA-ICS cohort is 1.34, that is statistically significant. When I went through the model building process, I determined that age was an effect modifier with less than or greater than or equal to 65 years of age, seeming like a good cut point to look at this data. When I adjusted that model for covariates that were seemed to be related to the outcome, patients less than 65 years of age, the LABA-LAMA cohort had an IRR of 1.04 that was not statistically significant, while patients who are greater than or equal to 65 years of age had an IRR of 0.96 that was statistically significant, but it was not very clinically meaningful. Then in my sensitivity analyses, where I threw in all of the variables to see if this changed the outcome, again, I saw IRRs that were not statistically significant between the two cohorts. So in conclusion, in adjusted analyses, there was comparable rates of COPD exacerbations between patients who were treated with LABA-LAMA versus LABA-ICS. And then while patients greater than or equal to 65 years of age had a small but significantly lower rate ratio of exacerbations, this effect was not observed in the sensitivity analyses, and it also didn't seem very clinically meaningful. So there's a number of different limitations to this data, or to this study. So the data was obtained from health insurance claims data, which is primarily used for billing purposes. So we have limited information on maybe specific measures of disease severity, like lung function, which is commonly measured in COPD. And additionally, we had based our outcomes on claims for an outpatient event, an ED event, or an inpatient hospitalization for COPD, but there could be other exacerbations that were maybe less severe that didn't lead to these claims that we have not captured here. So I'll say effectiveness here as well was measured by the rates of COPD exacerbation, and then there are a number of other indicators of effectiveness that should also be considered when selecting between a COPD therapy. Patient symptoms is one of them, one of the major categories, and patient reported quality of life is another category that's important to consider as well. And I have a more comprehensive list of limitations here as well. And this is my list of references. So any questions I could take?